All right. Acts 27, around verse 39. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, and at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. So what we're seeing here is, this basically is their last ditch hope. They see land at sunup. There's a bay there. There's a beach. They think, you know what? If we can make the beach, we can get there, everything as light as possible, get moving as quickly as possible. Maybe we can run this thing all the way up to the beach and run it aground, and we will be safely on land. That's what they're trying to do. So they hoisted the foresail, unloosed the rudder, which they had tied so that they would not be completely tossed, and then they cut loose all the anchors. So they're not even dragging the anchors that are intending to slow them down that we saw them put down earlier in the midst of the storm. They're wanting to get up as much speed as possible and try to make this beach as quickly as possible. And it says, but, verse 41, striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. So they didn't quite make it to land. They didn't make it to the beach. There was a reef, and they struck the reef. It says the bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. And so imagine, after weeks being on this boat, after this terrible storm, after all this ordeal, you end up getting stuck on a reef. It says the bow was stuck in this reef, and it wasn't moving. But the seas were still as tumultuous as they had been all along. The winds were still blowing as they had been all along. And it was such great force that the water was crashing on this boat that now could not move, that the rear of the boat begins to break apart under the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan, it says, was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. So, ancient Roman law 101, if you can't keep your prisoner under arrest, it's better to kill them and explain that to your higher-ups than to lose them and let them go free. So that's their plan. But it says the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. Now, what does that tell us? Verse 43 there. The centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. Why would the centurion care? Why wouldn't he have the same attitude that the rest of the soldiers had, which is, look, they might get away, so better than letting them get away, let's just go ahead and execute them now. By the way, what was Paul accused of? A crime that was a death penalty case. So the likelihood is he's going to his execution anyway. So what this tells us is the time that they have spent on the ship, the things that he has seen, the conversations that he has had with Paul, the speeches that he has heard Paul make, they've had an effect on him. Now he is looking favorably upon Paul. He is actually acting with grace toward Paul, trying to save Paul's life. He doesn't want them to execute Paul, so he stops them from executing anyone. And he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest on planks or pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Now, I want to draw your attention back to a little bit earlier in the chapter, starting around verse 22. And we'll reread verses 22 through 26. This is part of Paul's speech to them. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. And what we see take place in verses 39 to 44 is all of those things coming to pass. Every one of those things coming to pass except for the you must go to Rome part. But what was essential to make that come to pass actually took place as well. This becomes important because what you see here is that God is apparently using this centurion, who is at least to some degree sympathetic to Paul and to his cause and to what he has said. But God is using this centurion to help carry out the providential care of Paul and get him to Rome. What would have happened had it been left to the other soldiers is Paul would have been killed. But this centurion, who was a Roman soldier, was being used by God to preserve the life of Paul and bring about the very things that he had prophesied was going to take place. And so the ship was lost exactly as the messenger of God had said. The ship was a complete loss, but not a single life was lost as the messenger had said. It happened at the coast of an island as they had been told, and they were kept safely alive. What they find out in chapter 28 is, it says, after we were brought safely through, that's safely through the wreck. All right. This is described in relatively simple terms. Has anybody ever been through anything like that? You ever been in a boat that capsized? It's not really a simple process, is it? Not at all. It's terrifying. And it doesn't happen in moments. It happens over a long period of time before you get safely through, if you survive. Yes, ma'am?
I started swimming the opposite way. I was swimming down to the bottom and didn't realize I wasn't going up to the top.
Yeah, those things can happen. and listen, that's a whole lot easier to happen than people realize. It's very easy to get your bearings completely turned around. And so this was no small ordeal. It reads like a simple ordeal, but the next line, after we were brought safely through, that encapsulates the entire terrifying ordeal of the ship tearing apart and of them getting in the water and of them trying to make the beach. When they finally got ashore, it says, we learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and it was cold. The native people is what it says in verse 2 in the ESV. Some translations will use the word barbarians. Why does it use the word barbarians? Yeah, the reason it uses the word barbarians is real simple, because they weren't Romans, they weren't Greeks, so they were viewed as being barbarians. Exactly the same way that white Europeans, when they came into the United States, viewed the natives here. They were barbarians because their customs were different, because the way that they lived was different, because their speech was different. They can't be as cultured as we are. They have to be. So that's kind of what we see about them, however, is that they are clearly thoughtful, mindful people. The native people showed us unusual kindness. So their hospitality that they extended to the people on this boat and who had been subject to this shipwreck, the hospitality they exceeded what even Paul would have expected the Jews to show. It exceeded what the Romans would ordinarily show. It exceeded what the Greeks would have shown. This was unusual kindness. They kindled a fire. They welcomed us. It began to rain and cold, so they were providing for us the things that we most needed. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." I think that's an interesting attitude. Apparently these people of Malta had this conception that still lingers in people's head today, that eventually karma is going to get you. And so when this snake bit Paul, there was this assumption that he must actually be guilty, because even though he escaped the shipwreck and lived, fate was not going to allow him to escape judgment. That this viper was going to end up doing the work that he had escaped from. I want to read from Mark's Gospel just a little bit to you in connection with this event, because there's something interesting here in Mark chapter 16. I want to start reading in verse 14 of Mark 16. It says, "And afterward he appeared to the 11 themselves." This is Jesus, appeared to the 11. "As they were reclining at table, he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen." That's the ladies, of course, had gone into to the disciples and said, "He's risen," and they didn't believe him. And so he kind of chastises them for that. And the reason he chastises them is because he had already told them what? That on the third day he would rise. They shouldn't have been surprised about it. They shouldn't have been unwilling to believe the testimony, because they had already been told that's what was going to happen. So he's chastised them because of the hardness of their heart, their unwillingness to believe. Then he said to them, "Go into all the world, proclaim the gospel to the whole creation," which again is what we're reading taking place in the book of Acts, is the spread of the gospel. "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe." And so there are some signs in the first century that were going to be present among those who were believers, in a way in which you could determine whether or not. Speakers, we know, worked miracles as a way to confirm their message. Was there a New Testament at this point? Anybody? No, it hadn't been written yet. So they're speaking these things orally, and they have no proof of the truth of these things other than the proof that God supplied, which was their ability to speak in tongues, their ability to lay hands on people and heal them, and those kinds of things. And so, "These signs shall accompany those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents with their hands. If they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." And so, what we read about happening here to Paul is going to be a fulfillment of things that Jesus had told the disciples. Would be things that they would see as the spread of the gospel took place, to determine and confirm that God was with these people and God was with the work. "No doubt this man's a murderer, though he's escaped from the sea. Justice has not allowed him to live." Verse 5, "He, however, shook off the creature into the fire, and it suffered no harm." They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. So here are these people of Malta. These are not Jews. These are not Christians. These are the native people of the island of Malta. They first assume that he must in fact be guilty of the things that he's been charged of, and that he's going to die as a result of his guilt, that fate's going to take care of him, that karma's going to take care of him. They wouldn't use those terms. I'm using terms that we use today, which, by the way, we borrowed from some Eastern religions. When he didn't die, when he didn't even swell up, have any ill effects from it at all, they swing to the opposite end of the spectrum and assume what about it? He must be one of the gods. That's what happens when we rely upon our thought processes. Were these people of Malta ever right about who Paul was or what was going on? And the answer is no. They went from assuming he was a murderer to being convinced that he was a god. They never saw him as being a man who was under the protection of the God and under the blessing of God. It's what happens when we rely upon what we see to make judgments about things rather than what God has said. Do you remember the whole ordeal on the ship? They were all convinced that they were going to die. And Paul stood up and said, don't worry about it. God's told me that not anyone's going to die, and so take courage. I believe it will turn out exactly as God has said. You need to eat and be ready because you're going to live through this. And we talked about the fact that that's the epitome of walking by faith as opposed to walking by sight. The big contrast in the beginning of the journey, Paul is convinced what's going to happen before they ever even set sail. He says this is the wrong time of year, this is going to be a bad situation, and we're not just going to lose the ship, we're going to lose our lives. They get out there, everything about the situation looks as though Paul is correct in that assessment at the beginning, but God says, no, you're not going to die. And so Paul then changes and says, we're not going to die, and begins to behave as though he's certain of the fact that they're not going to die. That's the epitome of what it means to walk by faith and not by sight. Not looking at the situation as it appears and saying, oh, this means this, but listen to what God has said about the situation. When human beings rely upon themselves to understand and make sense out of things, we end up like these folks on Malta, where we either assume this or assume that or jump to conclusions. There are things going on that the Maltese, I wonder if they actually should be called Maltese people, I'm going to call them that the Maltese folks are not even considering. And yet they're certain this is a God. I wonder if Paul had asked them to do something, if they would have done what he asked them to do. Because he was a God. In the neighborhood, it says, of that place were landings belonging to the chief man of the island, a man named Publius. He received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with a fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, putting his hands on him, healed him. Mark 16 talked about that too, didn't it? When this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. So they stayed for a while. We're going to find out in the next verse how long they stayed on Malta. But they stayed for a while on Malta. They began to interact with the people. Paul, I trust, though the text doesn't actually say anywhere that he preached to anyone, I trust that he probably did share the gospel with people because that's what he was in the practice of doing. But he certainly healed a lot of people. People became aware of them. And I've been talking all this time and dealing with the mic on the phone instead of myself. Now y'all are going to be able to hear me better. It's probably going to be too loud now if you had your phones turned up real loud. They had interacted with them enough, had stayed long enough, had won the favor of the people of Malta, and so they resupplied them with everything they needed when they were ready to leave. After 3 months, it says in verse 11, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria, with the twin gods as a figurehead. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days, and from there we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium. And after 1 day of a south wind sprung up, and on the second day we came to Puteoli. There we found brothers, and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. I am persuaded that the brothers of verse 14 is saying that Paul found fellow Christians. It's possible that it would have been Jews. He did refer to the Jews still as brothers at times. It doesn't make completely clear in the context which it is, but I'm persuaded, just based on what I read here and how it's handled, that he found and was surprised to find some fellow Christians in this place, and that they pressed upon them and invited them to stay for 7 days, for a week with them. And so he said, we came to Rome. So he's finally made his way to Rome. This is part of the way in which he got there, and some of the things that happened along the way that brought him there. And it says, and the brothers there. So when he gets to Rome, apparently there are some Christians already in Rome. The brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. And so Paul has been through a lot. And he's been through this terrible ordeal with the shipwreck. He's been bitten by a viper. He's been 3 months on the island of Malta. He gets back on a ship. If PTSD was a problem, getting back on a ship was probably not the most exciting thing for these people who had just gone through a terrible shipwreck to be doing. But here they are back out in the ocean again. Then they come along, they get some favorable winds, they get closer to where they're going. Then he starts finding friendly people along the way. And to his surprise, when he gets to Rome, there are brethren in Rome who, upon hearing of his arrival, travel to where he is to meet him. And upon that meeting, it says, on seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. Can you imagine what I'll say it this way, what an encouraging sight it would be after all of that to see people that you share values with. Now, by the way, if we back up a little bit further, before the terrible storm and the ship and all that other stuff, Paul's now been under arrest for months for nothing at all and been persecuted mercilessly for nothing at all. And so to find kindred spirits who are there to encourage and to strengthen and to help him, just seeing them and being there was enough, it says, to encourage Paul. Now here's the question that I'll ask us to challenge us. When we come to see other believers, when we walk in the door on a Wednesday night after we've been out in the world and watching the news and dealing with things at work and dealing with people and seeing the things that go on and seeing how people treat other people. Some people in this room have jobs where they see a lot of underhanded behavior. Does just seeing our brethren encourage us like that? And if it doesn't, my question is, why not? Because it did him. Yes, sir.
Recently had Romans 1, so it's kind of popped up in my mind. This is in around 11. He's talking about kind of, I may impart to you some gift, but he's talking, then he says that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. And then he's saying, I'm longing to see you so we can be encouraged by one another.
Right.
And I just so it's significant because he's just basically that's what he's saying, that he thanked God and he was edified.
So he says Romans 1:11.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I'm repeating that mainly for the benefit of the people that might not have heard it on the live stream, and I wanted to make sure I had the right verse. So Romans 1:11 and 12 carries the same idea. There's other places as well, by the way, where just having someone there and seeing them and interacting with them, of which we share a faith, is an encouragement. It ought to be. That's the way it ought to be. That's the way our assemblies ought to be. Our assemblies ought to be places where we come together and we get strength from one another. And we're encouraging. By the way, it says on seeing them. This doesn't have anything to do, apparently, with anything that was said or anything that was done or anything that they brought him, but merely upon seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. He had hope. Yes, sir.
Just looking back over the Romans 11, he's saying, I long to see you. Now, you can assume that means perhaps conversation. Too,
Right.
But it's just interesting that he even used that language, I just want to see you.
Right.
And just seeing you will encourage my faith.
And it ought to mean something to us now if it didn't mean something to us before, because of what's been going on for the last year and 4 months. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I know there's some people that I haven't seen in that length of time. I think I've talked to most of them on the phone a few times at least. I know there's people I haven't seen in that length of time. Should it not be a point of encouragement to be together? And that's what we see here on the part of Paul. Paul was not expecting to run into these brethren once he got to Italy, but yet he gets to Italy and they're now in 2 places. He's found brethren. After 3 days, verse 17 says, he called together the local leaders of the Jews, and when they had gathered, he said to them, now, he calls the Jews together, and we're going to find out the purpose of that in just a moment. The reason he calls the Jewish leaders together, though, is to present his case to them. Keep in mind, he is in the Roman court system, but he's in the Roman court system because of Jewish charges. So he calls them and he says, brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. When they had examined me, they wished to set me at liberty, because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But because the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. And so we get a little bit more information here than we do in the earlier records of the trials. Apparently, these Roman leaders who find no guilt in him and say, we'd set him free, except apparently the reason why he was like, no, that's when he appealed to Caesar. And so he's saying that he was forced. He was forced to exercise his rights to be heard by Caesar because the Jews just wouldn't let it go. He said, I appealed to Caesar, though I had no charge to bring against my nation. I don't have a problem with my nation. My nation is having a problem with me. For this reason, therefore, I have asked to see you and speak with you, since it is because of the hope of Israel that I'm wearing this chain. And so he tells them why he asked to speak to them. He wanted them to understand that he didn't have a problem with the Jews, but in fact it was the hope of Israel that put him in the situation that he was in. Now, what did he mean by the hope of Israel?
Well, he was a resident in Jerusalem, so he was there trying to preach to them.
Yeah, exactly. He was talking about Jesus. Jesus was the hope of Jerusalem, or the hope of the Jews. And he is saying, look, all I'm doing is carrying my faith out to its completion, to its end. And that's why I'm in chains here. And they said to him, we've received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken any evil about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are, for with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. And so what they respond to Paul with is, you know what, we haven't received any formal charges against you. No letters from Judea have come saying that this is what Paul is guilty of. And he said even the people that have come from there haven't said anything bad about you at all. We don't really know anything about your case. But we do want to hear what you have to say, because we know that everywhere people are saying bad things about, and this is the language that's used here, with regard to this sect. We know that everywhere it is spoken against. What sect were they talking about? Well, they were talking about the believers of Jesus, which is what he was talking about when he talked about the hope of Israel. And so they, from his language and what he said, identified him with the Christians. And yet they didn't know a whole lot about Christianity. They hadn't heard a whole lot about Christianity. They hadn't heard a whole lot about Paul. And so they said, well, we want to hear from you. We want to find out what your views are, because we've heard a lot of negative stuff about the people that you're associated with, this sect. When they had appointed a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in greater numbers. From morning till evening he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. And so he spends all of his time not angling for his freedom from the Roman arrest that he's dealing with. He spends all of his time talking to fellow Jews, trying to convince them to have faith in Jesus. The very thing that had put him in his situation. What does that tell us about Paul's faith? What does that tell us about Paul's concern for his own situation? Because I'm going to tell you, I know what most people would do here. Most people would spend all of their time trying to get free and then argue, I need to do this because if I'm free of this then I can go back and accomplish something. But as long as I'm under arrest like this, I can't really do anything. I'm under this cloud. I can't. But instead of trying to win his freedom, Paul's only concern is to share the gospel. We see that over and over again, don't we? When he was before Agrippa, instead of arguing with Agrippa and trying to get his freedom, what did he do? He said, do you believe the prophecy? You know you do. And he talked about Jesus and reasoned with Jesus with him. And that's when he says, well, in such a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? All of his time, He's not worried about his personal fate. He's worried about people hearing about Jesus. And he tries to convince them about Jesus from the law and Moses and from the prophets. And some were convinced by what he said, and others disbelieved. Verse 24 may be the most important single verse in the New Testament, because that is the story of all people, at all times, in all places. When they are confronted with the gospel, some are convinced by what's said, and some disbelieve. That's what happens. Why does that happen? Here's the outline for class popping up behind me. Why does it happen that some believe and some don't? Think about that. We'll talk about that